What would happen if we were extending our kitchen example, and this I am recording, and let's do all of this work by hand, okay? Let's build up everything that Router does for us automatically and Scaffold does automatically by ourselves. So the only thing I'm gonna do is generate a model, and let's call it recipe. And let's give the recipe a name, and let's give it an author. What else might we want to know about our recipe? Difficulty.
Ingredients.
So now, listen to the way you said it, ingredients, plural. So anything that's a plural is going to be a relationship.
Right.
That's how when we start saying and describing our interface, oh, a recipe has many ingredients, we know that that cannot be a column, that has to be a relationship. Yeah?
Same as category?
Hmm?
Same as category?
Yeah, let's do category. That's enough.
Yeah.
So this is going to generate for us a migration and a model. If we look at that migration, this is the Ruby code that it just wrote for us for making a recipes table. Okay? So this is the code that if we ran it with Rails db migrate, we'll create that table in our database. That's the purpose of migrations, to create tables, alter tables, destroy tables, and indexes, and some things we haven't delved too deep into. But Rails migrations are for changing the structure of your database, not putting data into your database, changing the structure of your database. So if we generate a model, the thing that migration creates for us is a migration that just creates the table. If we discover 3 days from now that, oh shoot, we missed a column in this migration, we can generate a migration that says add 1 column to the recipe table. But by default, the model just spits out a migration, and we should find a recipe model. And that is enough for us now, if we wanted to go into Rails console and create a couple of recipes. Okay? We can now use our recipe class to create taco explosion. Author, it's me, so we can just create a couple of we can create a couple of recipes, right? Having the migration and the model is enough for us to start using console to interact using our Ruby code to create some recipes, to seeing all of our recipes, to counting our recipes, to summing up the difficulty of recipes, right? Whatever we need to do with our database, right? We can start working with it. That's enough for just creating the model in the migration. But if we look at Rails routes, right? We only have foods in this weird active storage thing. Right? We don't have anything about recipes yet. So let's do this. Let's pretend like in the routes that resources didn't exist. Resources weren't a thing. If resources weren't a thing, we would have to say get /foods to, no, not foods, recipes, to the recipes controller index. Right? We can. Oh, did I? Recipes. Thank you. Right. If we didn't have the idea of resources, I would have to start one at a time defining these. Get recipes ID to recipes show. Now that I've done that, now I have, oops. Oh yeah, one too many hashtags. Now when I do this, now I have recipes and recipes show. Now if I needed create, I would have to do post recipes to recipes create. And now I would have the create. So forth and so on. I would end up having 5 of these teaching router what URLs go to what controller methods. Well, that seems like a lot of extra work, right? I don't have to keep doing these 5 standard routes every single time. So boring. Instead, I can just say resources, recipes. And now I don't have to do all this BS. Right, it also gives us delete, and we're missing update, right? Put.
Isn't it destroy instead of delete?
Oh yes. Here. Yeah, it always bothers me that it's called delete here and it's called destroy there. ID to. Right, like this. So instead of doing all that every time, I can just say resources recipes, and lo and behold, I should have yay, right? Recipes, 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 all of those things. But if I run Rails server and I go into my browser and do localhost 3000/recipes. Oh shoot, uninitialized constant recipes controller. I don't know what a recipes controller is. Was what Rails is saying. Is like, hey, you told me, dude, that if you go to /get/recipes, I should find a recipes controller that has an index method. Well, I tried to go find your recipes controller to make one for you, but I didn't find one. So manually what we'd have to do, oh, so boring, is we have to come into controllers and we'd have to make a recipes controller. And we'd have to say class recipes controller is an application controller. And we would have to define this controller ourselves. These are all of the things that Scaffold is doing for us. Cool. Hey Rails, you have a recipes controller. Did I spell something wrong?
Oh yeah, 2 L's instead of 1. You need 2. Yeah,
Yes.
you need 2.
2 L's. Okay, cool. You have a recipes controller, but there's no index method. Why is it index? Well, because that's what we should have done. So what if we make an index method? We don't fill out any code. Did I save it? Saved it. Right, but I'm not getting anything. I need to render something. Let's render an empty array. Cool, now at least I'm getting an empty array. But I don't want an empty array. What do I want? I want all the recipes. So instead of rendering an empty array, let me render the recipes that I got. Let's talk about that. I don't. The scaffold uses the @ for a specific reason. If you don't say anything at all, if you just do this, a render is implied. Right? A render is implied. What you're going to get is, you're going to end up getting an error in here. Let's run this again.
How do you stop the Rails server?
Control C. We got no content. There was nothing rendered. What it wants now is it wants a view. So we either have to tell it render JSON recipes, or we have to specify a view file. So we haven't talked about view files. A view file is like having an HTML file, but in this case it's going to be a JSON file, and it's going to describe how to render the data. Right? If we don't have that, then what we have to do is down here in the views folder, we would have to make a views recipes new file index.json.jbuilder. And this jbuilder is something we're going to talk about later. This is a view file that's going to describe how to render JSON.
Oh, maybe that's better without I for recipes.
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Recipes this way. Yeah, that should be fine. That's weird. Recipes.
Maybe in your culture.
Yeah, I don't know. It generated that file. Yeah, I don't know why I made an IES here. I'm not sure. It should be recipes. I'm not sure. It might have been me earlier messing around because I was prepping to do recipes and I may have mistyped it before here. But we haven't talked about we haven't talked about views yet. So imagine that in this view file, we're going to talk about jbuilder tomorrow, or maybe we'll talk about it this afternoon at 3. This file would be a whole nother language we're going to learn for describing how to build JSON output. So the question is then, how does the view know what data comes from the controller? The controller wants to pass information from it to this view file. And the way that it does it is it makes these things an instance variable. Any instance variable in the controller is visible to the view. Right? So every instance variable that we make in the controller in the index method becomes available in the JSON jbuilder here. Right? If we make it a regular variable, those regular variables don't get passed along. Only instance variables can get passed along. So that's why in the even though we're not using the view in this point, right? This does not. Just makes the JSON right there. The scaffold tends to use an instance variable because that's a pattern that repeats a lot. It's so common that we use view files that even when we're not using them, we still tend to use instance variables for data that we get from the database. It's another convention that we follow as Rails programmers, because when your JSON gets more complicated than just give me back the columns from the recipes, what if the recipes also need the steps involved? What if the recipes also give me some information about the foods that they involve, right? Now we have a bigger, more complicated JSON structure. This little shortcut of rendered JSON recipes fails us. When we get to interrelated models, this shortcut will fail us. And what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to come into our controllers and get rid of this and start using jbuilder files. We haven't quite gotten there yet. That's a topic for Wednesday or Thursday, maybe this afternoon. Right? What happens when our JSON structure gets so complicated that this shortcut no longer works? What we have to do then is remove the render JSON from our controller and start using an external file that will describe that complex structure. And the way we get data from the controller to the view is via instance variables.
Will you always have to start rendering JSON first before you realize how complicated it is?
Typically.
When you're manually doing the controller part
Mhm.
first, you really want that so you can see your, okay.
Yeah, if I can get away with this, I will.
Okay.
Because rendering the JBuilder stuff is even more complicated and confusing. So if the default render JSON the thing is good, I'm gonna leave it. Because it's super simple. And then I'll say, oh shoot, yeah, you know, for the index for my recipes, I really want the recipes and all the steps associated. Okay, I'll go take the moment to go write the jbuilder file for it.
Mm-hmm.
Now the trick is, let's do this. I'll give you a sneak peek. So if we had in our gem file, found inside of here, it's in here somewhere. Where did it go? Right here. Build JSON APIs with ease. See how jbuilder is commented out? If we had told Ruby and Rails, hey, I want to use jbuilder by default, if we had uncommented jbuilder, then if I had done, instead of Rails generate model, if I had done Rails generate scaffold, I would not get rendered JSON : I would get jbuilder files. I would already get the more complicated version. See how it's saying like, hey, I'm gonna overwrite the recipes controller because I'm gonna write one for you. Notice that this time it made a JSON jbuilder file. And you'll notice now that my views folder for this has all of this weird JSON stuff in it, right? There's an index JSON and a show JSON. And if you look at my recipes controller now, aha, what's missing? Render JSON :
Oh, yeah.
right? Look at the show, it's actually empty,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because all it's gonna do is this, find the recipe and render the show JSON, right? Because we uncommented jbuilder, we're already getting the more complicated structure. You're welcome to start there as well. If you think your data is going to get more complicated, when you go to generate your scaffold, make sure jbuilder is uncommented and you'll get the more difficult version. I tend not to show that first because in order to explain everything, I also have to explain what jbuilder is, and your minds are already blown from controllers and models and scaffolds and methods. But this is probably how most people will generate their scaffolds. They will probably just go ahead and generate the jbuilder anyway, once you understand what jbuilder is.
I had two questions. One with the jbuilder, is that necessary for when we have interrelated models?
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I guess, I mean, say I have 3 models. I'm going to eventually need to, I don't know if that's going to be really complicated enough JSON. I guess
Maybe.
That's what you mean.
Yeah, because if I do this, so if I, let's go take a look at what happens now if I load the recipes. Let's start the server.
We also have to build our ERDs and then
Right, well, that will
find out.
Yeah, well, that's
I think
If I run the server now,
yeah, I think.
and I look at the recipes, recipes control is missing a template for this request. Recipes is here, and recipes is here, and it's here. Why are you complaining about that? It's missing a template for this format. Oh, now it wants me to put .json on the end. Yeah. So here's my JSON, right? So if I want something else that's not in this object, maybe what I want is also for every recipe, I also want to put in I want something like the difficulty in English, right? So difficulty English is not part of my model, but I can go into the JSON and start adding more attributes. Or right? This jbuilder is a more flexible way of generating JSON, but it's a harder thing to understand.
Yeah.
Right? So probably, and by default, when you generate the scaffold, it's no different, right? It's going to generate the same JSON, just in a slightly more code-heavy way, which is why when I first show this, I don't start talking about the jbuilder version. Because it starts to do weird things like there's nothing here in the show, and that looks weird. Like, oh, it's an empty method, right? And the fact that this just gets all the recipes and doesn't do anything. Now the @ symbol on recipes is important, because if I do this, if I just say recipes equals recipe all, right? Now it's like, there's no recipes to be found, because the only thing that the view can see are the instance variables that come from the controller. The way the controller passes data over to the views is via instance variables. That's why this week, when we've been seeing our controllers generate from scaffolds, they use instance variables, because it's a pattern that we follow pretty closely. The scaffold for non-jbuilder could totally use regular variables. Absolutely. Right? If we were just doing render JSON, this works perfectly. Right? There are our recipes. But if we're using the view version, if we forget the @ symbol, we don't get any recipes until we make this an instance variable. And now that array jumps over to the view, and there's all of our recipes. Right? That's why you were asking today, and why, Tatiana, you were asking the other day, why are these instance variables in the controller? Because when we get to the point that we use an external view file, the only way data jumps from the controller over to the view, so the view can see it, is via instance variables. So they continue that pattern in the generated code for the render JSON : version, the viewless version, as instance variables, just so that we don't have two different ways of referring to those variables. Right? If we go look at our foods controller that doesn't use them, right? Render JSON foods, there's no reason this has to be an instance variable here at foods equals, right? Because we're rendering the JSON right here, we're not using views. Here's our foods. All we're left is with one steak, right? Because we're not using views, this could just be a regular old variable. It doesn't have to be an instance variable. But for consistency, that's how the scaffolds generate them. It's been a long debated thing in the Ruby community that the use of instance variables to pass things from the controller to the views was a bad decision made 13 years ago and shouldn't have been done. We should have had a different way of doing it, but that's what we have, and that's how it is. You just know that in a controller, an instance variable we create so we can pass that variable over to the view to be used. It's up to you. If you want to use the viewless version, awesome. If you then have to switch to using the jbuilder version, cool. Uncomment the jbuilder file, generate your scaffold, regenerate your scaffold, now you get the views. But maybe tomorrow we'll walk through jbuilder and why it is and how it works. It's a really messy syntax, so that's why I don't cover it very early on, because your brains are already hurting from other things, and I don't want to hurt them more than they're already hurt. But a few of you will probably need to use jbuilder because your APIs will be complex enough to require it.
So if we have JSON, like difficulty English equals hard, will that then be placed in every model that's associated?
It'll be in every time we ask for a recipe as JSON.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
Right, every time we ask for a recipe JSON, this difficulty hard will be here.
Okay,
but
cool.
what we probably want is something like this. We probably want something like, if the recipe difficulty is greater than 3, hard, otherwise easy. Right, we probably want like a little bit of logic there. Ah, look, this recipe is easy. But what if I go into Rails controller, Rails console, I mean. Let's make another recipe. Let's call this burger pizza. Its difficulty is a 4 and it's also fun. Right, so I just created a second recipe. Aha! That recipe is easy. This recipe is hard.
Cool.
That difficulty English is not a column coming from the database. It's something that I'm generating at the time that I'm making my JSON. So if you have something like number of stars, right, in you're making your review site, 1 through 4 stars, and 1 means horrible, 4 means excellent, you can generate the text version of it in your JSON, even though it's not part of your database. This is what jbuilder lets us do, add more information to our API, maybe based on a computation. All difficulties right? Or later on we'll see, oh, every time I ask for a recipe, I also need all the steps, right? Render JSON : can't do that for us easily, but jbuilder can. I would say probably at least half of you are probably gonna have to go this way with jbuilder because you're gonna need nested data and what. The only one that may not, Mira, you may not need jbuilder for yours because it's just a list of videos and a list of images and a list of,
I would
right?
need it.
You may not need jbuilder. Your API is more wide, it has many things, it's not necessarily nested.
Yeah.
These are probably more nested, so you'll need jbuilder. What's nice is jbuilder, the default that it generates for you is pretty good. So we only have to add a few things to it in order to add more, because it's the same as doing JSON : just more explicit, right? Is the difference between like, right, the Ruby students can just do render JSON : recipes and psh, there's your JSON, versus like a more explicit version like what C# or .NET would have to do, listing out everything and all the steps. Hey, I need from the recipe, I need the ID, the name, the author, the difficulty, the category. See, I have to list everything. Where for the foods, we just said, hey, just give me all the things about the food. I didn't have to say what columns I wanted. But with jbuilder, you do, right? It's a more explicit version of generating JSON. That's all.
Can I see the thumbnail real quick?
This was just me creating a new recipe. And this is me just running my Rails server.
Can I see the new recipe?
I'm just using the create on the model to make a new recipe whose name is Burger Bonanza, whose author is Gavin, the difficulty is 4, and the category is fun.
And that's the recipe class
Mhm.
which you're creating.
Yes, I'm asking the recipe model
Right.
to create me something, and these are all of the columns, the values that I want for that new recipe. This new recipe's name needs to be Burger Bonanza, its author needs to be Gavin, its difficulty is 4, and its category is fun.
So front-end side, how does the difficulty look like? It's gonna be just the input so that they can
If I was making a user interface for it, I would probably make it a drop-down,
drop down.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Minesweeper and
Right.
beginner, intermediate.
Yes,
and
exactly.
all that
It would be
stuff.
exactly like that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Can I do the rest?
Yeah, I think we're done for now. We'll just get back at 3.
Cool.
And we can just talk about how we're gonna, maybe we can talk about the homework in a little more detail, how you might break that down,
Cool.
and get started with it. We'll do that at 3. That make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.